For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. If you would like to support the channel and become part of our ancient history fan community, visit patreon.com/World of Antiquity. Welcome to Trowelocity, a new video series in which we talk with archaeologists and ancient historians about their work. In this episode, we'll be speaking with archaeologist Jeffrey Blomster, who has been in the news recently. While working in Oaxaca, Mexico, his archaeological team came across the oldest ball court that has ever been discovered in the highlands of Mesoamerica. We now know the game is much older than previously thought. We're going to speak all about it with him and more. But first, if you like the idea of this series, please press the like button and don't forget to subscribe. Okay, let's talk archaeology. Jeffrey Blomster is an anthropological archaeologist whose work has focused on the Olmec, Mixtec, and Zapotec cultures of Mesoamerica. His particular interests are concerned with how complex societies arise, interactions between societies in neighboring regions, and the spread of styles, rituals, and ideologies across space. He received his undergraduate training at Washington and Lee University, and he earned his PhD in anthropology and archaeology at Yale University. His dissertation, which examined the site of ATLA Tango in the mountains of southern Mexico, was awarded a distinguished honor in 1998 and was published as a book in 2004 under the title ATLA Tango, Social Complexity, Interaction, and Village Life in the Mixteca Alta, Oaxaca, Mexico. He is currently Associate Professor of Anthropology at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he has been teaching since 2005. Professor Blomster has written numerous scholarly articles for journals and is the editor of the book After Monte Alban, Transformation and Negotiation in Oaxaca, Mexico, and he wrote 2 of the book's chapters. But of course, Professor Blomster doesn't just spend his time in the classroom and writing. He has conducted archaeological field work in the Mixteca Alta of Oaxaca, Mexico, as well as laboratory analysis of the finds from his expeditions. More recently, he has been in the news following an astounding discovery that he and his colleague, Victor Salazar Chavez, and their team made at ATLA Tango, the remains of a ball court estimated to be 3,400 years old, which, from what I understand, pushes the origins of the game back about 100 or 800 years. We'll definitely be talking about that. Anyway, welcome, Professor Blomster. I hope I got all that right.
Thank you. Yeah, well done.
Welcome to the show. I'm glad you could be with us today. It's a treat to have you. So my first question for you is, what made you want to be an archaeologist?
Well, and I think like a lot of good questions, there's no real easy answer. Certainly as a youngster, I didn't think archaeology was something people really did for a living. It just seemed more like some fantasy. But I was very fortunate, as you pointed out, where I went to college, Washington University. We had both a full-time professor who did some archaeology. He also did a lot of cultural anthropology too. But we also had a research archaeologist on the staff. And he actually did a lot of, or was in charge of the various sort of cultural resource management projects that sometimes the archaeology division took on, and it always involved students. So it did seem that there actually was a way of trying to earn a living doing something that seemed really fun. And I think even, I know even as a young person, I had a interest in old things. I'm not sure why some people just sort of have that interest, but I did. And but it didn't really seem something particularly bankable until I was lucky enough in college to sort of see both the academic side of it, but also the very important cultural research management side. And of course, that's where most of the archaeology jobs are in the United States these days.
I haven't heard of any archaeologist billionaires out there, but
well, bankable in the sense that you can support yourself.
Yes, that's right. Well, the same thing with history. I do history, and it's like, well, it's a living. It's you at least can pay the bills, right? Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, how did you get into the particular field of study that you did, and who did you study under?
Okay, so when I went to graduate school, because my undergraduate training had been so broad, I actually was sort of very open to what specific thing I studied. I mean, my undergraduate background was very much, for subfield approach in anthropology. So, it was actually for me making a big decision just out of those four subfields. I wanted to do archaeology. I thought all the subfields of anthropology were just so interesting. So that was sort of thinking I had made a big decision just to do archaeology. And then I ended up going to Yale University. One reason is because they had a really good four subfield program. So it seemed perfect for me. But once I was there, it was very clear that you needed to focus pretty quickly on sort of a spatial and temporal focus, so that indeed you could get the training and the resources you needed. So it was a sort of a learn on your feet kind of thing. And my students now, I always try to get them to focus as soon as possible, because it really does help you out in the long run. But for me, my interests were very much the rise of early sociopolitically complex societies. What makes some societies more would have people with more power than others. I mean, how does that even happen? And that's obviously something that anthropologists and archaeologists have studied, throughout the history of the discipline. So for me, being at Yale, it was a fairly, I think, quick decision to pursue that in Mesoamerica, since my advisor at Yale was Michael D. Coe, who unfortunately recently passed away. But this is certainly in line with some of his interests too. So it's always, of course, good to have an advisor, a mentor who you share interests with. It makes the whole process a little bit more engaging. So that's sort of, I guess, how I ended up where I ended up.
Okay, yeah. So for those who don't know, could you briefly explain? I know it's hard to be brief on this because it's a big question, but
Yeah.
who are the Olmecs and the Mixtecs and the Zapotecs?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So, it was, it was anthropologists who defined, the whole concept of Mesoamerica, the idea that, this isn't something you'd find on any normal map. But basically, the idea is that you have an area sort of just a bit in northern Mexico, going all the way down to sort of the western part of El Salvador and Honduras, where the people within that zone have some shared traits that they have similar calendar systems, etc. So when the Spanish arrived, there were of course some very vibrant civilizations that they documented in the process of destroying them, and so a lot of the names we have, of course, for groups like the Mixtecs, the Zapotecs, a lot of these are of course not these groups' own names for themselves, right? These are names imposed on them by the Aztecs or sometimes other groups. So I say that because most of the groups that I focus on are so much earlier than the ones that were there at the time of the Spanish conquest. We don't know what they call themselves at all. So while technically, I consider myself somebody who works on early Mixtec society, from about 1000 BCE. I doubt there is any concept, of some kind of a group ethos or ethnic identity that we might call Mixtec today. And similarly, so basically, what I'm saying is around 1000 BC, there were a lot of different civilizations in Mesoamerica, and some of them are probably related to the groups that are there today.
So what separates the three from each other then in our minds?
Well, they all have very distinct historical trajectories.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, for example, the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs, both spoke sort of an ancestral common language, and the Zapotecs and Mixtecs, separated, thousands of years before the time period I'm interested in, into sort of distinct linguistic and ethnic groups. The Olmec are a totally sort of different thing. So, the Mixtecs and Zapotecs are both in modern day Oaxaca state. And that's where my research is situated. But for me, studying the early villages that existed around 1000 BC, it seems like you need to study some of the other civilizations that these people might have been in contact with. And for 1000 BCE, sort of the one group you really need to know about are the Olmecs from the Gulf Coast. So again, we don't know what the Olmecs call themselves. There's even a debate, what language family did they belong to? So there's a lot we don't know about them. But we do know is around 1000 BC, they were probably the one group in ancient Mesoamerica that had what some people call an urban civilization at the site of San Lorenzo. There's been ongoing research there now by Ann Cyphers for decades that has just vastly expanded, our knowledge of the site. My advisor, Michael Coe, worked there in the late 60s. And at his time, he thought the site was 53 hectares total. And Ann Cypher's research has shown it was more like 700 hectares. So, this is a massive site. And this is the group, as you can see behind me, that made colossal heads.
Yeah, that's what everyone, I think, knows most about them is the heads.
Yeah, so this is a group that were doing some things that other groups in Mesoamerica weren't doing yet. And people like Ann Cyphers or Michael Coe and others certainly thought that they were on a different level, sociopolitically than their contemporary groups.
Okay. Did any of these groups write?
So that's an interesting debate. So the Zapotecs actually have a very, very early script that starts about 500 BC. So about 500 years later than the time period that I normally focus on. But for years there's been isolated, icons or symbols of the Olmec that people have suggested maybe represented some kind of a early form of text, but there's really never been good evidence until, I don't know if you know about this, a few years ago, they found this slab called the Cascajal slab.
Yeah, I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. That might be from about 800, 900 BC. Unfortunately, it was sort of found by accident, so we don't have a really good, very good sense of its context. But it does have what many of us think is some kind of an early script or text. But of course, it's really hard to decipher, one example of something. But it certainly suggests that people who have thought that there was some text or some kind of system like that for the Olmec, it suggests that they probably were right.
Oh, so which leaves open the possibility that we could find even perhaps writings from a little bit earlier.
It's possible. Yeah. I mean, I think none of us expected something like that. I mean, I certainly never expected to see something like the Cascajal slab. I mean, it was a real surprise for many of us.
Mm-hmm. Now, what made ATLA Tango a significant site that made you want to go there, even before the discovery of the ball courts and all that? Why is it an important place?
All right. So it was, for my research, it was a really sort of the perfect site in many ways. So, my interests are, again, the rise of socio-politically complex societies. And I'm also very interested in interregional interaction, and if there's sort of like a, cause and effect or some kind of a relationship between these things. So this site was located on a survey of the Nochislan Valley back in the late 60s. And it seemed clear from talking to some people who knew about it that, it did have some of this so-called Olmec style pottery, that it may or may not be a fairly large site for that time period. That's really hard to determine without excavation. But fortunately, in 1980, an archaeologist named Roberto Zarate did a series of test units sort of right along, there's a road that cuts right through the site. So he basically used the road as sort of one wall of his unit. And he did a series of test units. And, he found some very deep deposits. And he did find some of this kind of pottery that has, sort of icons and style that may indicate, at least some knowledge or interaction with the so-called Olmec style.
So is it Olmec or is it just Olmec-like?
Well, so, I think the important point is that, um, first of all, for me, there's a couple different Olmec phenomenon. So I just work on, the early formative. And so people call that the early horizon or sometimes the San Lorenzo horizon. So for me, there are, a very distinct group of icons or symbols that appear on pottery from both San Lorenzo and also on some of the carved stones, the monuments from San Lorenzo. And then those motifs appear at other sites, not many, but at other sites on pottery throughout Mesoamerica. So the appearance of these kind of symbols often, evokes the term Olmec style. And that's a term I'm usually willing to use, but with this caveat that it doesn't mean that that material came from San Lorenzo. It certainly means that, people who made those pots with those symbols knew about it and were maybe making either pottery that hewed sometimes very closely to pottery we know about from San Lorenzo, or making their own local, sort of interpretations of it.
So just to make sure I understand correctly, do you mean then that only the people who lived at San Lorenzo or La Venta later are Olmecs, and the other ones who lived in the area aren't exactly?
Right. So I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you asked that. The Olmec are one of these very contentious topics in Mesoamerican archaeology. And most of my colleagues who are up at the Olmecs, one of the first things they have to do is define what they're talking about with the Olmecs. So some people will just use that term Olmec for sort of, anyone in Mesoamerica who was familiar with and maybe used and innovated this kind of pottery. For me, I take a more restricted use of the term Olmec. For me, Olmec people lived in the Gulf Coast, specifically at Olmec sites like San Lorenzo and La Venta. And I think for a long time, archaeologists were sort of guilty of just sort of homogenizing the whole Gulf Coast as Olmec land. And we now know that, the geography of so-called Oman or the Gulf Coast is a lot more complicated than we thought. So, both topographically and culturally, the geography. So, I think that we know that there's sites like San Lorenzo and its sort of whole hinterland would be, Olmec sites of Olmec people. But for me, I don't think the people at ATLA Tango were Olmec. I would never call them that. I mean, they were, I think, ancient Aztecs, but some of whom came in contact with Olmec style materials.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a really good question because I think that one of the really very intractable debates in this discipline is, what is the nature of the Olmec style? What does it mean when you find Olmec pottery at a site? And, part of the problem is, the whole concept of Olmec style was defined by museum curators before we knew anything about the archaeological Olmec. So, you have museum curators like 100 years ago who were finding these pieces in their collections like, oh, these things sort of look alike. They must come from like the same group of people called Olmec. And all of a sudden, that term was applied to any site, in Mexico that had maybe one sherd with like a cross, with a cross on it. All of a sudden became Olmec. And so I think in the 60s, there was a very useful debate where archaeologists not working in the Gulf Coast, by then, of course, we knew the big Olmec sites like San Lorenzo, La Venta in the Gulf Coast. So you had, I think, a really useful debate where people sort of pushed back against that idea and said, no, having one sherd from a site doesn't make it an Olmec site. And in fact, a lot of the things that were called Olmec by these museum curators, a lot of them had really no valence. They had no real presence at the Gulf Coast Olmec sites. You just had sort of this very sort of sloppy term that included way too many things. It's sort of what happened with Chavez, if you're familiar with Chavez civilization of Peru. For example, Richard Berger was really important in saying, you have all these sites that are called Chavez because they got, one sherd with like a incised circle on it. And he just said, basically we need to sort of purge that term of all these sites and traits that have been associated with it. So I think if we're more careful in what we call Olmec style, it will make sort of our interpretations more robust.
I see. So it's not just just superficial similarities we're looking for to define this as a culture, but a whole host of features that
Exactly.
characteristics that unite them.
Right.
I see. Yeah. So when you first went to ATLA Tango, what were some of the more important finds early on, and who did you go with? And tell me about some of that early work.
Okay. Yeah. So I was looking for a dissertation project, and ATLA Tango seemed like a very good project, a good place to work. And I was very lucky that the group that controls archaeology in Oaxaca is called the INA. In English, that's the National Institute of Anthropology and History. And they were very amenable to me working there. Even the previous excavator, Roberto Zarte, was super nice. So it just seemed like a really a great place to work. I mean, the problem for me, since I'm interested in the early formative, is that the site was occupied until post-classic. So that means the entire site is covered by thousands of years of other occupations. So
And what do you have to destroy stuff to get down to the?
well, I would prefer not to use the word destroy, but you have to excavate through and properly document and record everything. So it's a sort of pretty slow going process getting to those early formative materials. So when I first got to ATLA Tango, what was really interesting is the person who done the survey of that whole valley, it's in the Nochislan Valley, was Ronald Spores. And he had actually separated sort of two ATLA Tango sites. So there's a modern village called San Mateo ATLA Tango, and sort of to the southeast of it was what he thought was the early part of the site, which is sort of between two rivers. And he thought there's sort of a big unoccupied space, and then sort of the classic and post-classic site was on a hill. So the first thing that happened when I was there was realizing that there was no unoccupied space between what he had defined as two separate sites. That probably in the post-classic was one massive site. So that certainly made testing it a little bit difficult because, again, my focus was really just the early component of it. You sort of can't do a site like that justice if you're going to try to look at every different phase. So what we did is, sort of did a surface survey. I was lucky I had a couple other archaeological students, and of course I had a great team of people from the modern town of San Mateo ATLA Tango helped me. And so, we through a surface survey, we were able to have a pretty good idea of where the early part of the site was. And I think the early part of the site probably covers about 26 hectares. And it's mostly in the southern part of this sort of really big site. So what was interesting is the very first unit I excavated was on what we now call Mound 1-1. And that's sort of in the southern portion of the site. And the southern part of the site is relatively flat, except there's one sort of raised area. And, it wasn't clear, could this just be, a bedrock outcrop? Why was this area higher? So it seemed like a good place to put the first test unit. And I remember a colleague from the ENO was actually there with me, and he said, oh, put it towards, you can see it's like a little bedrock outcrop over there, so you won't go too deep. So I put it just like a few meters from that, and it went down 3 meters, this unit. And it was 3 meters until we actually got to, unmodified bedrock. And what was really, really interesting is we had, a meter and a half or more of early remains. And a lot of those were either like a platform fill, they were actually being used to construct something, or they were being used to fill in something. So
was that a surprise, or were you kind of expecting it?
Yeah, that was not, I mean, again, I was there to look at an early village, not something that had substantial public architecture. So, and one of the surprises of that unit was there was a layer, was it like 20 or 40 centimeters, that was just packed with little ceramic figurine fragments. So, again, this is, the figurine fragments from that little layer were like 10 times the quantity or frequency, I should say, of anywhere else at the site. So it seemed something unusual was going on there. And so I only did that one test unit at Mound 1-1 in the 1992 project. And for years I've said, well, this seems like an area of possible public space because there's obviously some large scale modification of the landscape here. You don't do that for a normal house. But most of my project in 92 stuck to the goals, which were actually, finding fragments of houses and trying to get a sense of what these houses look like. And, basically figuring out that there was certainly, sort of a higher status group of people who were able to have these houses that were on sort of small platforms, and they had, a fair amount of this so-called Olmec style pottery, as well as other things, which frankly we hadn't anticipated either. So it was
But
one of these things.
you were thinking though, I have a reason to come back now later.
Yeah, and I didn't think it would take me 22, 23 years to come back. But yeah, so for years I had just an incredible amount of things to publish because we found such fascinating materials. But ultimately,
this is it's kind of related, but I figure I should ask it now because you just mentioned it.
Yeah.
After a year's dig or whatever, how long does it commonly take to finish up the process of cataloging everything and analyzing everything and publishing all about it?
Yeah, I wish there's really no standard answer to that. It depends on the size of your team and the size of your budget. In my case, since this was a very small dissertation project, it took I think close to a decade really to get everything recorded and in a format that I could use. But if I had this new project was a lot bigger, so we made a lot better progress. So for years as I was publishing this stuff, and I kept coming back to that one test unit, I'm like, clearly something very unique is going on here. And as we documented the figurines from that one little test unit, they just had such a variety to them too. Sort of the kind of imagery that I wasn't expecting from the early formative, or some of the imagery was very much, again, Olmec style, that it suggested that that would be a really good place to explore again at some point. So, finally, 22, 23 years later, I finally had the opportunity to do it again.
All right. So let's talk about the big brouhaha here about the recent discovery. It was in the news and everything, and that's how your name came to my attention. There were a couple of ball courts, right, that were discovered at the site.
Yep.
So can you tell me a little bit about the circumstances of their discovery?
Well, sure. So, anyways, in 2015, I had a grant and a permission from the INA and a lot of cooperation and advice from both the INA. They have their main office in Mexico City, but then they have branch offices in all the states of Mexico. So, working very closely with the people in the Oaxaca branch of INA, we had this great project. And so I was, of course, not just me, I was the principal investigator, but I had graduate students and also some excellent Mexican graduate students who weren't part of my university, but that were part of the project too. And of course, a wonderful crew from ATLA Tango itself, again. And in fact, some of the same men who helped me in 1992, I mean, almost all of them came back for this project. So that was just I think that was one of my favorite parts of the project, that, the project in 1992, 23 years later, I had almost my whole crew back again. And it was just, so much fun to exchange stories of, our lives. And, some of them, of course, I've been in touch with. I always go back there. So they're a handful that I see I've seen almost every summer since the first project, but, still there are many I hadn't seen in a long time. And it was just wonderful to get to sort of know them all over again. So we had a fairly large project. This was a 3-year project funded by the National Science Foundation. So the goal, again, was to get a better sense of houses and how people lived. From the 1992 project, the houses that I felt I documented pretty thoroughly, all of them seem to be higher status houses. So, we had maybe a corner or some scrappy parts of less high status houses. So we really wanted to try to find more of those, so we had a better comparison. But of course, I also want to go back to Mound 1-1 and see what was going on with that test unit. So basically, all 3 seasons of this project involved pretty large-scale excavations on Mound 1-1. And the very first season in 2015, it was very clear that something substantial was there. We found part of a wall in now what we know is the southeast corner of the ball court. And what was really intriguing, and that we didn't really flesh out better until the 2016 season, is in the northern part of our operations on Mount 1-1, we kept coming down to this, at 3 meters or so, this really well-made level floor. It was sort of a combination of modified bedrock with some fine clay. And it was just so flat and consistent. And then we kept finding it, increasingly at pretty far distances from where we first encountered it. So, basically a typical structure, a house would be maybe, 4 to 6 meters long. And, we were finding this, 12, 14 meters away from where we first found it. So then it's like, well, what could this be?
You knew it was big, right? It had to be big.
It was really long.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem like it didn't seem possible it could be any kind of interior space. We had to sort of reject that. And by the end of the 2016 season, we had it sort of found it almost everywhere we were looking for it. And we had pretty much figured out that it was long but narrow. So we were putting our tests, we had basically figured out the orientation of it. And so we were putting basically our units in a way that would hit it if it was there. And
were you guessing it was a ball court even before you confirmed it, or?
No. I think it was, that was one of these ideas that had been sort of loosely, almost like jokingly brought up. Actually, one of my colleagues from the INA was visiting us, and we were showing him the wall, which had like just a little bit of a slope, and we hadn't even really got to the, all these floors yet. And he just said, oh, maybe it's a ball court. I'm almost like, oh, there aren't any ball courts this old in the highlands. That can't be possible. So what we thought, and we thought this until well into the 2016 season, it would be the kind of public architecture that we have at a contemporaneous site in the Valley of Oaxaca. So there's very important Zapotec site in the Valley of Oaxaca called San Jose Mogote, excavated for many decades by Kent Flannery and his team, and then again more recently by some of the archaeologists from the INA Oaxaca. So like Enrique Fernandez has excavated there. So what they found, that this was a pretty large village, comparable actually to ATLA Tango, and they found that what made it different, though, is it had what they interpret as public architecture, and they had two types. They found these sort of fairly small, almost square structures that were raised on small platforms that sometimes had like a bench or a pit with lime, sort of powdered limestone in it. And the excavators, I think, correctly said, well, this is not a typical house. I think what's sort of more debatable, they've called them men's houses, sort of a place where the initiated men of the society sort of hung out, whatever. Clearly, though, it's some kind of a non-purely domestic unit structure of some kind. So they found those, but then they also found two larger platforms. So they found basically, a platform is used to support another structure. So what they found was the foundation of a platform that was, some of these were, they found two separate ones that were obviously much bigger than these little square structures. And they interpret them as, and I think correctly, as platforms that might have had a perishable structure like a temple or something on top of it, but there's nothing left of whatever structure was on top of that. So that's what we were looking for. We're like, okay, these clearly aren't these men's houses or whatever those things were, but this is probably a platform. So what we need to find, platforms have corners. So we kept looking for the corner. It just was never showing up. And, it was clear that what we had, if they were platforms, they were bigger than the ones from San Jose Mogote, or they were longer. So, so between that and then this consistently, extraordinarily well-made floor, by the end of the 2016 season, that was our hypothesis, that this really does appear to be a ball court, but it seems, again, so unlikely because, the people who worked at San Jose Mogote, both Flannery's team in the 70s and 80s, and then the more recent research by Enrique Fernandez, they've excavated a lot more of that site than I've excavated at ATLA Tango, and they never found a ball court. So again, it just seemed implausible. So what we did in the final season in 2017 is we basically did a transect, sort of a long, narrow unit in the upper part of what we thought was the ball court, so we could get one really good profile. So what we've had, we have all these sort of scattered units, but so what we wanted was one long, narrow unit that would give us one decent profile, so we could actually see in profile, the sloping nature of the ball court with that floor on the bottom, and we got it. Unfortunately, a lot of the ball court was destroyed by later occupants of the site. They were often digging there, to get soil or to get other things, mining it in a sense. So it was hard to get like one good profile. So the profile we published in that Science Advances paper is a composite of, the best preserved profiles of it. But it was really clear from this transect that that's what it was. And, all along, obviously, I was paying a lot of attention to the kind of artifacts that were coming from it. And, the figurines, ceramics were all consistently from that, early formative time period. But it wasn't until, of course, after the project was over and we had sent off a series of carbon samples, and those all came back, over 11 of them as, again, consistently early formative. So it sort of took a while for all these different pieces to come together, right?
And then you found a second one, right?
Yeah, so basically what we have are two superimposed ball courts.
So one's an older one and one's a newer one.
Right, but they're both early formative. So what we think happened is, what we found is right above bedrock, or bedrock was exposed by the ancient people and they modified it. So there's a structure that we've just been calling structure 1-1, which we didn't find a lot of it, because covered by later things, which we obviously aren't going to destroy to expose it. But it looks like it's probably a pretty long structure, and maybe it's even an earlier ball court or some prototype. But it seems like it does seem like it's made primarily of modified bedrock. We did find a few post holes in it that suggest there was some kind of a temporary or a perishable structure on top of it. But that's a structure I think we're never going to be able to find much of, because again, it's under the eastern part of the other ball courts. So, and then on top of that is structure 1-2. That's the earliest ball court. That's the one that in calibrated dates is around 1375 or so BCE. So that one is a combination of modified bedrock and then actually stone, sloping stone wall that in a sort of a matrix of packed earth. And that one has this very well defined alley. The long floor that we were finding, it has these little shallow, what we call banquettes or benches. They're just 20 or 30 centimeters high. That's a very typical ball court feature. And then you start above that, get the sloping wall that gives it sort of its distinctive shape. So that's the first ball court. And then there's a small layer of a little bit of fill on top of that. And then the second ball court, the more recent one, is placed directly over it. But the second ball court, what we call structure 1-3, is larger than the first one. So they basically took the original ball court and expanded it. And one of the interesting things is they also changed sort of the nature of the architecture. So those little banquettes are gone. They didn't reproduce them in the newer version. Instead, you have an extremely sharp angled sloping wall that the ball would have been hit off of, rather than having those little banquettes. Mm-hmm. So it does suggest some local innovations in actually the playing of the game, perhaps too. So structure 1-3 is, as we point out in that article, very large. We exposed a fair amount of the eastern portion of it. The western portion, we just have part of the wall, but we don't have most of the mound itself. Mm-hmm. So what we have a pretty good sample of the eastern mound. So basically the ball court's formed by an alley and has two mounds that flank it on either side that really define that space. So we actually have a good chunk of the eastern one. And the eastern one, interestingly enough, has on its surface, we exposed the top of that eastern mound of the second ball court. And it actually also had a perishable structure on top of it. We found post holes of a structure. And, I wish we could have excavated within the post holes, but there was actually a modern monument that the people of the town had made there, which obviously we weren't going to touch. But very interesting that it had this sort of little, what was a pretty small superstructure just on that eastern mound. And for both ball courts, structure 1-2 and structure 1-3, we have a very good sense of the northern limits, and we found part of the northern boundary. But the southern boundary, we weren't able to find. There's been so much destruction of the southern slope that I don't think anything's left of it. So that's why in that article we're sort of, like forced, we have like I guess, wiggle room on the overall length of the ball court of 5 or 6 meters, just because we just can't say for certain where the actual southern extent of the ball court is.
So, how do these courts fit into the overall history of the ball game? And maybe you could tell our audience just a little bit about the ball game too. But like fitting this now into the ball game's history, how would we see that?
Sure. Well, so the ball game is one of the fundamental features of Mesoamerican civilization. All the different civilizations have it, and we know that it's important in politics, religion, cosmology of these societies. That the movement of the ball is often talked about, sort of the movement of the sun through the sky, and that we know sometimes conflicts could be settled by a ball game between different parties. I think for a long time, I know when I was in grad school, at least, archaeologists sort of talked about the Mesoamerican ball game like there's just one thing. We now know there were a lot of ball games and other athletic activities that were played in ancient Mesoamerica. So what it seems like is the game that we might call like the Mesoamerican, like the state ball game, is probably the one played with a hip, where people would be hitting a rubber ball from their hips. And some of my colleagues think that's the one that really does require, at least in some cases, actually an architectural ball court. So the reality is, a lot of games that could be related to the ball game could be played, on any surface. They could be played in any flat space. So, even today, there in Oaxaca, there are people who play a version of the ball game, in basketball courts, anything that's a flat surface. So, for us, what's interesting about what we found is that we do think that most civilizations in Mesoamerica probably had a version of the hip ball game, something that was probably similar enough between civilizations that they would recognize it, as well as all these other kind of games, which probably varied from civilization to civilization. So again, the hip ball game is the one that probably did have a court, although it certainly could be played without a court. So what we know about the history of the hip ball game, or at least the ball game that requires a ball court, is sort of scattered. So for a long time, it was thought because the rubber plant that you get the rubber ball from occurs mostly on in the Gulf Coast and Pacific Lowlands, that would be the natural place for the ball game's origins. So that's where we stood for a long time. And of course, there was a lot of imagery from those areas, little ball player figurines and other things that suggested, okay, these areas probably had the ball game pretty early. And of course, the Olmec. There are a couple sculptures from San Lorenzo that show what some people think are ball players. So that's where things stood until the early 90s. And in the early 90s, two important things happened that I guess promoted this lowland origin of the ball game. At the Pacific coast site of Paso de la Mata, which is on the coast of Chiapas, not too far from the coast of Chiapas, archaeologists found what we know is the earliest ball court, and that dates to about 1650 calibrated BCE. And all it is, it's an alley with two long lateral mounds on either side, and then with very shallow banquettes. That's pretty much it. No end zones, anything like that. Just two long lateral mounds with an alley and the little banquettes. And then also in the early 90s, not too far from San Lorenzo, archaeologists excavated a site called El Manatí, which was located at an ancient spring with a small hill. So it probably had been a very important, sacred site, a site of pilgrimage. And because it became a auction-deprived environment, perishable materials survived there. So El Manatee is sort of famous because of these little wooden busts in the Olmec style that were found there. But the archaeologists also found actually quite a few rubber balls that were preserved. Now, the rubber balls were offered there, so we can't say they were necessarily directly played in a ball game, but they some of them date as early as that Passe la Mata court, and then they were offered throughout, the early formative through, the apogee of San Lorenzo. So it seemed like a pretty tidy argument that if we again talk about the ball game as the hip ball game, the requiring a ball court, it probably did develop in the lowlands. In the highlands, the earliest courts we know of are in the central highlands, and they date to about 500 to 600 BCE. So they're 1,000 years after Passe la Mata. But what's pretty interesting is at Passe la Mata, it has the earliest ball court, but this is a site that's produced a huge corpus of ceramic figurines, and none of those early figurines show ball players. So it's almost like as if everything about the ball game wasn't quite there. And then at El Manatee, you actually have what might be actual balls. And of course, at San Lorenzo, you have ball player figurines and sculptures of ball players.
Are the colossal heads ball players?
Some people think that those helmets are ball player helmets, but we don't know. But there actually there's a sculpture, it's called Monument 34 from San Lorenzo that looks like it shows a ball player. And a few other sculptures have been interpreted as ball players. Mm-hmm. So, San Lorenzo is sort of interesting where, all right, you have a site, very close by El Manatee where there's equipment from the ball game. You have actual images of ball players at San Lorenzo, but there's no ball court. And, that site's been excavated by many, very talented archaeologists without finding one. So that was sort of the picture, is that it seems like the ball court probably has this, lowlands origin. But there's some you don't see everything in one place. So it was so that's where we stood. So for me, what's interesting about what we found is that we have, these two ball courts. The earliest dates to 1375 calibrated BCE, and we also have ball player figurines. So to me, it shows that Highland people like the Mixtecs at ATLA Tango were very involved in the actual sort of architectural format of the ball court. Now, again, aspects of the ball game existed before this, but sort of putting it together is probably something that involved different parts of Mesoamerica. And maybe the Olmec had a big role in some of the paraphernalia and the symbolism of it, but at least with the data we have now, it doesn't seem like they were particularly instrumental in the actual layout or blueprint, if you will, of a ball court. And when we see the ball court at ATLA Tango and the earlier one from Passe la Mata, it's sort of fully formed. You've got your two long lateral mounds and the alley between them. I mean, that format is there. By the time, for example, we have the next earliest one in the Highlands are these ones. There's one at the site of La Laguna that David Carballo excavated. You already have like full, the typical Mesoamerica I-shaped, capital I-shaped ball court with real end zones. But it's still that basic, if you take away the end zones, it's still two long mounds with an alley between them. So, what it suggests is that, different regions were involved, but they shared like this common, they sort of contributed a common sort of template of what this ball court should look like. And, maybe we'll find earlier ones, but this is sort of where we are now.
Is there more excavating going to be done, or are you finished?
I don't think we'll be excavating. I suspect very little will be excavated at the ball court. Again, the ball courts at ATLA Tango and such, so poorly preserved due to, the actions of later people at the site. I don't think we'll get much more from excavating them, but I think what we might do, what we've done, like in the Science Advances article, we're sort of projecting, the size and the overall form of the ball court by using, bilateral symmetry. That since we know the shape of the eastern mound so well, we're sort of projecting that's what the western mound looks like. And we do have.
How large of a settlement was this?
ATLA Tango?
Yeah.
Well, so it's 26 hectares it would have covered.
But I mean, do we know what that would be in population?
I wouldn't even go there. I mean,
okay. But I mean, was this a city or was it a town or village?
So I would say it was a town. I would say it was a large village or town. So ATLA Tango would have been the largest village in the Nochislan Valley at 12 to 1000 BCE. So I think what I would be interested in doing is just maybe trying to find like the western edge of the Western Mound just to confirm that our estimates of the size are correct. And it would be really interesting to see if there also is like a superstructure on the Western Mound like we have on the Eastern Mound.
Yeah.
That would be, I think, worth doing. But otherwise, I think we're going to do very little additional work on that ball court.
I just have a few last questions.
Sure.
We're running low on time, and these are ones that come up among my viewers and people who are just in a popular audience might ask. And they're just different questions about Olmec society and so forth, not related directly to the ball court. The first is there, this sometimes comes up, is there in the field of archaeology an orthodoxy that you're discouraged from questioning?
I would say so. There certainly are certain colleagues who have staked out, sort of a very firm, we might say, position on things. I think the Olmec get at many of these firm positions. So, the nature of the Olmec remains a real debate where a lot of colleagues who work in areas like Oaxaca see the Gulf Coast Olmec as just one of many, sort of complex societies in the early formative, while some people think that they actually were sort of on a different level of sociopolitical complexity. So so there is this. I think in terms of the ball court itself, I don't necessarily think there was an orthodoxy saying there can't be highland courts. It was from this time period. It's just no one thought that they would exist. It was sort of like like almost a question not even worth posing, since it did seem like the idea of a lowland origin for at least the ball game with a ball court had been pretty well established.
Okay. Here's another one that comes up. Did the Olmec originate in either Asia or Africa? And if not, how do we know that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm glad you asked it. It seems that there's still among some people this persistent view that the Olmec came from Africa. You look at some of these colossal heads and people seeing like African features, whatever that means. But I think most of us think that it's actually a more interesting story that the Olmecs developed without any external connections to the old world. And I think my issue with the whole Olmec having an African or Asian origin, it's just an inherently, I think, ethnocentric or almost racist argument that indigenous people in the New World weren't capable of coming up with these complex civilizations without the old world's involvement. So the reality is the people who have tried to talk about, for example, African origins, use very sort of basic elements like, oh, well, they have sort of similar facial features, and look, they all have platforms, just pyramids like they have in Egypt. But of course, the Egyptian pyramids are often funerary monuments for a pharaoh, while so-called pyramids in Mesoamerica are often platforms for simply another structure. And sometimes, there might be a burial in them, but often, more commonly, the importance of these platforms is they elevated a temple or another structure on top of it. So, if you do look at the features that have been put forward as somehow showing a connection between Africa and the Olmec, they all fall pretty quickly under any kind of sustained scrutiny.
Okay. The Maya long count, from what I understand, places the beginning of history in 3114 BCE. Is there any historical significance to that date?
I think if you ask different Mayanists, you probably can get some different perspectives. I think, the reality is we just don't know why that was such an important date for the Mayans. We just don't know. But, what's really interesting, again, I'm not a Mayanist, but I'm lucky I have, colleagues who are really smart who are Mayanists. And it's just amazing. The Mayans had an enormous concept of time that went deep back, covering tens and tens of thousands of years in the past. Um, People have been able to read some of these these texts, and it shows, calculating times that went back, again, tens of thousands of years. So the Maya had an extremely sort of deep history.
Mm-hmm. Olmec Stila 19 from Levanta shows someone holding what appears to be some kind of a bag. I don't know if you're familiar with the stela.
Yes. I just saw it a few months ago, actually.
Okay. What is that he's holding?
It does show a man holding sort of like a pouch, right?
Yeah.
And that's an interesting piece because he's sort of seated in the coils of this snake, and the snake does look like it has feathers on it, and it has a rattle. So some people think it's a very early image of what's later called Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And that is an interesting, I think still 19 is a very interesting piece because it does have sort of an area above that seated figure that has quetzal bird tails, and then sort of a blank space, like a tablet under it that might have actually had maybe painted icons. So, so some of my colleagues, like Carl Talby, have projected, that could be a sort of almost like a text-like thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I heard that the bag might be an incense bag, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, those could, it could be, those are sometimes what they're holding. But in this case, I think what's more interesting about that is what's actually above that seated figure. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, those are my questions.
Great.
So I want to thank you again for it's already been an hour. Can you believe it? For talking about this with us. Where can people find you on social media? And if they want to find out more about this subject, where can they find it?
Well, a couple of things. So, again, a lot of my research is about the early formative, and I'm interested in symbols, iconography. So I'm just going to show you this book. So I just edited this book with my colleague David Cheatham, and it's called "The Early Olmec in Mesoamerica Material Record."
I didn't even put that in my introduction.
Yeah, that's okay. It's from Cambridge Press, and it's 2017. And what it does, we invited colleagues who work in different parts of Mesoamerica to basically say, what do you have from, this site in Guerrero, this site in central Mexico, or, we have a couple of different colleagues working in Oaxaca in the book. What do you have that we would call Olmec style, and why? One of the points I was making earlier in our interview today is that, people haven't been very robust about what they call Olmec style. And I think, if we can strip away all the junk from of it and actually come up with, clear features that we might all agree on our Olmec style, we may better have a sense of where does this stuff actually appear and what does it mean? So one of the things we do in this book is we have a chapter looking at icons. And we actually say, rather than calling, these complex composite icons, things like, the fire serpent or the word jaguar, let's just strip them down to like, this is basically an upside down U. This is, a cross span. So we're calling this, motif 1, motif 2. And then let's look at those individual motifs, which are then combined into larger compositions of things that might be, word jaguars or dragons or whatever you want to call these things, because once you get to the level of composition, it becomes extremely interpretive. But, we can look at these specific icons and see what different parts of Mesoamerica are using them and how are they combining them with different icons to make compositions. So I thought that was a really useful thing that we did. So that's, if people are interested in that.
I'll leave a link to where they can find the book below, as well as one to your article on the ball game.
Awesome.
Ball court. Thank you very much. And can people follow you on Twitter or Facebook?
I'm not a Twitter person, but we do have an ATLA Tango project website. I think it's just, atlatango.com.
Okay.
And, it's sort of in Spanish and English. So that's where we put like reports and things like that.
Okay. Sounds great. Well, thank you for taking the time today with us.
Yeah.
And we look forward to hearing more coming out of that area.
Thank you. My pleasure.